The winter of 1787 came early to the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. By the time the 17-year-old David Thompson and his small party of Hudson's Bay Company men reached the foothills of what is now southern Alberta, the short prairie grasses had gone stiff with frost, and the first serious snowfall had already laid itself across the coulees and the benchlands. Thompson was not yet a surveyor. He was not yet the man who would map more of North America than anyone before or after him. He was a boy from a London charity school who had spent the last several years clerking for a fur company in an unfamiliar land. And on that autumn morning, riding west toward mountains that rose above the horizon like white clouds that did not move, he was following a Piegan guide whose name he did not yet know how to pronounce. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Piegan were the southernmost and largest nation of the Blackfoot Confederacy. They called themselves Piikáni. They had controlled the northern Great Plains and the foothills country of what is now Montana and southern Alberta for generations, and in the late 18th century their territory stretched across an area larger than France. They had horses. They had their own political structures, their own ceremonies, their own military alliances, and their own enemies. They had been doing business with the Canadian fur trade in one form or another since French trappers first reached their country in 1748. And by the fall of 1787, the Hudson's Bay Company had decided it needed someone to spend a winter among them. Thompson was the one they sent. What he saw that winter would stay with him for the rest of his life. Much of it he wrote down in journals that are still studied today. And one of the things he wrote about, carefully and with the particular attention of a man who would spend the next 40 years measuring the world, was the way the Piegan moved across the winter country, the way they read the land, the way they followed animals across distances that seemed, to his European understanding, entirely without landmarks, the way they knew, in the deep cold of January on a white and featureless plain, not only where the buffalo had been, but where they would be. The country Thompson entered that fall was described by the naturalist George Bird Grinnell, who spent years among the Blackfeet in the 1880s and 1890s, as probably the richest game country on the continent. Grinnell documented what Thompson and every other early visitor had already observed, that the Blackfoot territory contained far-stretching grassy prairies for the buffalo and the antelope, rough badlands for the mountain sheep, wooded river bottoms for the white-tailed deer and the elk, narrow swampy valleys for the moose, and the snow-patched rock pinnacles of the Rockies for the white goat. The Chinook winds that swept east from the mountains kept many winters mild by the standards of the northern plains, and the short prairie grasses, as Grinnell recorded, were sweet and rich even when cropped close by summer grazing. It was a land built for the hunting of large animals, and the Piegan, over generations without number, had become the most thorough readers of it. Understanding what the French trappers encountered when they arrived in 1748, and what the English clerks and explorers encountered in the generations that followed, requires understanding something the history books tend to skim past. The Blackfoot Confederacy was not a wandering people in the sense of aimless movement. They moved along specific routes in specific seasons for specific reasons that were not obvious to anyone who had not grown up learning to read the land the way they read it. In summer, the Confederacy gathered for large collective ceremonies and for the great communal buffalo hunts on the open plains, where hundreds of hunters working together could drive entire herds into carefully engineered enclosures. In winter, according to the records gathered both by Thompson and by later scholars, the bands strung out along wooded river valleys, camping perhaps a day's march apart, sheltered from the worst of the wind by the trees and the river bends, with firewood at hand and the winter buffalo close by in the timber, because that is where the buffalo went. The bison that ranged the northern plains were not the same in winter as in summer. By November, they had grown a thick secondary coat, a dense underfur that lay beneath the coarser outer hair and made them far more cold-resistant than any domesticated animal. They moved into the timbered river valleys and the sheltered coulees, where the snow was less deep and where they could use their massive heads and the heavy dark hair of their winter faces to brush the snow aside and reach the dried grass beneath. In the deep drifts of the open plains, a full-grown bull weighing 1,800 pounds could move only with difficulty, lunging through snow that came to his chest. In the timber, moving shorter distances between feeding grounds, they were manageable. And the Piegan hunters knew this the way they knew everything about the buffalo, which is to say that they had always known it, and that the knowledge was not separate from the rest of their understanding of the world. The Piegan winter camp was positioned not by accident, but by long calculation. The bands settled in wooded valleys because those valleys held firewood and shelter, yes, but also because those valleys held game. From the winter camp, hunters went out on foot or on horseback to read the condition of the snow and the timber for signs of where the herds had moved. What they could do in that reading, what they had refined over generations into something that looked to outside observers like an almost supernatural ability, was something that every man and woman in the camp had learned from childhood, and that each generation passed intact to the next. David Thompson spent the winter of 1787 and into early 1788 in the camp of a Piegan band in the foothills east of the mountains. He lodged with a very old man named Saukamappee, an elder who had been born Cree but had joined the Piegan as a young man and lived among them for decades. Saukamappee spoke to Thompson in Cree, which Thompson could follow well enough, and over the course of that long winter, he told Thompson the history of the Piegan through his own memory and through what the elders before him had carried. Thompson wrote it all down. He wrote down the stories of the wars with the Shoshone, the arrival of the horse, the arrival of the gun, the great smallpox epidemic that had swept through the camps in 1781 and reduced the Piegan by, as Saukamappee described it, more than half in a single season. He also wrote down what he saw happening around him in the winter camp. The way men went out before dawn to check the snow conditions in the coulees east of the mountains. The way a hunter returning in the evening could describe, with a precision that startled Thompson, not just the direction the buffalo had moved, but the approximate number of animals and the approximate time since they had passed a given point, read from the compression of the tracks, the depth of the plunge holes where heavy animals had driven their hooves through the crusted surface, and the condition of the dung left behind. The dung mattered in ways that took Thompson time to understand. Fresh dung in cold temperatures holds its heat for a period that an experienced reader can estimate. A pile that is still steaming tells one story. A pile that has crusted on the outside but is still soft beneath the crust tells another. A pile frozen through tells a third. Combined with the track record, with the direction of the travel and the gait the animals had been moving at, these signs gave a hunter not just a location but a timeline, a picture of where the herd had been and how long ago, from which the experienced mind could project forward to where the animals were likely to be now. Thompson, who would spend his adult life calculating positions from observed data, recognized what he was watching. He was watching men do, in a landscape of snow and cold, something functionally identical to what a surveyor does with instruments and recorded observations. They were triangulating. The instruments were simply different. Saukamappee, in the evenings by the fire, sometimes explained what the hunters had seen and why they had drawn the conclusions they had. Thompson understood enough of the language by the second month of that winter to follow the main lines of these explanations, though not the full detail. What he understood clearly was that the explanations were not vague or approximate. They were specific. A hunter describing the morning's reading of the snow was not saying the buffalo went that way. He was saying something more like, a group of perhaps 40 animals, moving at a walk, past this point sometime in the night, probably between the time the temperature dropped and the time the wind shifted, which gave a span of a few hours, and they were moving toward the stand of cottonwoods along the lower bend of the river, where the grass is still accessible and where there is shelter from the northwest wind. That level of specificity, from a set of signs in the snow, was what startled the Europeans who recorded it. Not the tracking itself, which they understood in principle. The precision. Snow is not a uniform surface. A man who has read it for a lifetime sees in it a record of everything that has passed over it. And when that record has been read and reread across a lifetime of seasons, the information it contains becomes as legible as any text. The Piegan hunters who worked the winter country around the eastern Rockies were reading a text that their fathers and grandfathers had written explanations of, a layered document in which each day added new pages and erased old ones, and which had to be read with full attention and with all the knowledge the reader brought to it. There were things in that reading that the French and English trappers who encountered the Piegan in the 18th and early 19th centuries could not account for within their own frameworks, and that they therefore described in their journals with varying degrees of astonishment and, often, with the honest acknowledgement that they did not fully understand what they were seeing. The fur trader and Hudson's Bay Company explorer Peter Fiedler, who traveled through the Blackfoot country in the early 1800s, was one of those observers. Fiedler was a trained surveyor, methodical and precise, a man who recorded weather observations almost every day he was in the field and who, at a post called Chesterfield House on the South Saskatchewan River, sat down with visiting Blackfoot chiefs and produced from their descriptions a series of maps of the Western Plains that were accurate enough to be incorporated by the cartographer Aaron Arrowsmith into the best maps of North America then available in Europe. These were not men who did not know the country. They knew it in extraordinary detail. And what Fiedler and his colleagues recorded was that the Piegan and the broader Blackfoot Confederacy knew it in ways that a different kind of knowing, a knowing built not from instruments and recorded observations, but from 10,000 mornings on the land. The question of how to read winter in the northern plains is not a simple one. The open country east of the Rockies is, in winter, a landscape of frequent contradiction. A warm Chinook wind can reduce 2 feet of snow to bare ground in a matter of hours. Then a new storm can cover everything again before morning. The snow itself varies by how it fell, by how cold it was when it fell, by whether wind packed it into a crust or left it loose and deep, by how much time has passed since it fell, and how many freeze-thaw cycles have worked through it. A track left in fresh powder tells a different story than the same track left in wind-packed crust, and then frozen again overnight. Both stories are readable. Reading them accurately requires a knowledge base that is not acquired in a season or a winter, but across a life. The Piegan child who grew up in the winter camp east of the Rockies learned to read snow the way a child in a settlement learns to read writing, by constant exposure beginning before conscious memory, by watching the adults around them, by being taken out and shown, by making errors and being corrected, by the gradual accumulation of pattern recognition that eventually becomes something indistinguishable from instinct, but is not instinct at all. It is learning. It is the accumulated and transmitted knowledge of a people who had been reading this particular landscape, in this particular way, for a very long time. George Bird Grinnell, who collected his material on Blackfoot hunting customs from men who had practiced them, and from Hugh Monroe, the veteran frontiersman who had been adopted into a Piegan band in 1814 and spent years living as one of them, documented the winter hunting methods in considerable detail in his 1892 book Blackfoot Lodge Tales. Monroe described for Grinnell the technique of disguising oneself in a wolf skin to approach buffalo that had grown suspicious of upright human figures. By putting on a large timber wolf skin, tying it at the neck and the waist, and crawling toward the herd on all fours, a hunter could come close enough to shoot multiple animals before the others registered alarm. If an individual buffalo looked up suspiciously, Monroe wrote, the hunter would howl like a wolf. He had seen this done many times and had done it himself. But there was more to it than disguise. The approach required reading the wind, reading the posture of the individual animals at the edge of the herd, understanding which direction the herd was likely to move, and in what order the animals would spook if startled, all of which was information legible in the behavior of the animals before the hunter came near enough to shoot. A man who could not read those signs would not get close enough to use his disguise. The disguise was the final step. The reading came first. Monroe was specific about the wind. A hunter approaching a herd in a wolf skin had to keep the wind in his face. The buffalo's eyesight was poor by the standards of the animals they shared the country with, but their sense of smell was acute, and a wind carrying human scent from behind a hunter into a herd would end the approach before it began. On the open plains in winter, the wind was rarely steady. It shifted and eddied around the coulees and the timber edges in ways that a man could learn to read from the behavior of the snow surface and the movement of the dry grass stems that still stood above the drifts, and from the feel of it against his face and the backs of his hands. Reading the wind over a herd from a distance of several hundred yards, calculating the approach angle that would keep human scent out of the animal's range for the full length of the crawl, required exactly the kind of continuous, real-time reading of the environment that distinguished a skilled winter hunter from one who was still learning. Monroe noted that when a bull looked up from grazing and turned toward the approaching hunter, the hunter froze. Not just stopped moving, but froze entirely and held the position, however awkward, for as long as the animal watched. The bull would look, lose interest if nothing moved, and return to grazing. This too was knowledge, the knowledge that a buffalo's threat assessment system was built around movement, and that stillness, combined with the wolf's skin disguise, could hold the animal's attention at the level of mild curiosity rather than alarm. Getting that calculation wrong meant the herd ran and the day's hunting was over. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The winter Pis'kun, the great buffalo impound that the Blackfoot built at the base of cliffs or constructed of timber and packed snow in the timbered valleys, required a different but equally demanding form of reading. The method that Grinnell documented in careful detail required runners to locate the buffalo, assess their behavior, determine the direction of the wind and the condition of the ground, and then begin the delicate process of moving the herd toward the mouth of the chute. In winter, Grinnell recorded, when the snow was on the ground and a herd was being led toward the impound, the people set out a line of buffalo chips supported on small sticks so that each chip stood a few inches above the snow, placed about 30 feet apart running straight out from the mouth of the corral. Against the white of the snow, the line of dark chips was conspicuous, and when the buffalo were running down the chute, they always followed it, never turning right or left. This was not luck. It was engineering, the application of careful observation of animal behavior to the problem of mass harvest, and it had been developed and refined over generations of practice until it was reliable enough to stake the winter food supply of an entire band on its success. The reading of the landscape extended beyond the tracking of animals. The Piegan hunters working the country east of the Rockies maintained a knowledge of the terrain that was spatial and environmental in ways that the European concept of navigation did not fully capture. Peter Fiedler's experience at Chesterfield House illustrated this clearly. The maps that Blackfoot chiefs drew for him were not maps in the European sense of a representation of the land from above. They were relational maps, showing the connections between rivers, mountains, passes, and hunting grounds as experienced from within the landscape, from the ground level of a person moving through it on foot or on horseback across many seasons. The information was accurate. Arrowsmith used it. But the framework in which it existed was entirely different from the framework a trained surveyor brought to the same country. And when Fiedler tried to reconcile the two, the effort required him to understand that there were things the chiefs knew about the land that he could not replicate from a set of instruments and a notebook. Hugh Monroe spent years as an adopted member of a Piegan band after arriving as a 16-year-old Hudson's Bay Company employee at Rocky Mountain House in 1814. He was assigned to live with the Piikáni nation, to learn their language and their customs, and he eventually married the daughter of a respected Piikáni leader. He participated in their seasonal practices across many years, including the winter hunts, and the knowledge he accumulated was the knowledge of a man who had crossed from one understanding of the world into another and been changed by the crossing. When he described what he had learned to Grinnell decades later, he described it as a body of knowledge so complete and so integrated that separating out any single element of it for explanation was like trying to explain a single word of a language without explaining the grammar. The French and Canadian trappers who worked the Blackfoot country in the late 18th and early 19th centuries came from a culture that had its own deep tradition of woodcraft. The voyagers of the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company were not soft men from settled country. They had their own skills for reading weather and moving through difficult terrain. What they encountered in the Piegan winter camps was a set of skills that overlapped with what they knew but extended past it in ways they recognized as different in kind, not just in degree. The French trapper and interpreter Francis Lamprey, who had spent more than 2 decades in the Blackfoot country by the 1850s, was a man with a legitimate claim to knowing the northern plains in winter. When he encountered a particularly severe winter and remarked that he had never seen the like, the context matters. He was not a newcomer. He was a man who had been there through hard winters before. The winters he had seen the Piegan navigate, in camps strung along wooded river valleys, with their reading of the snow and their knowledge of where the buffalo would be when conditions turned severe, had shown him something about the relationship between long-accumulated knowledge and survival in difficult country that most Europeans who passed through the region more briefly could not see as clearly. The buffalo themselves made the reading both possible and necessary in a specific way. The great herds of the northern plains were not randomly distributed. They moved in patterns shaped by the condition of the grass, the depth of the snow, the direction of the prevailing winds, and the relationship between those factors and the topography of the specific country. An experienced Piegan hunter knew, in the way that a person who has lived in a place their entire life knows things about it that a visitor does not, which coulees would hold buffalo when the temperature dropped below a certain point, which river bends would provide shelter when the wind came from a particular direction, which timber stands would draw herds when the open plains were iced over and the grasses beneath the snow were unavailable. This was not mystical knowledge. It was observed knowledge, accumulated through seasons of watching the relationship between weather, terrain, and animal behavior, and organized into a practical body of understanding that could be applied to the problem of feeding a band through a northern winter. The Piegan winter camps positioned in the timbered valleys were not positioned by habit alone. They were positioned by calculation, by the application of exactly this kind of knowledge to the question of where, on a given year, given the conditions coming into winter, the people needed to be. The French trappers who first arrived in 1748, and the English and Scottish traders who followed them, came into this country with their own skills and their own ways of reading the world. They recognized what they were seeing. The journals and accounts that survive from the early contact period are full of honest observation and honest acknowledgement of skill. What the trappers found, riding into the winter camps of the Piegan and watching the hunters go out before dawn and come back in the evening with accurate information about where the herds were and how they had moved, was a competence in reading the winter landscape that they could see clearly, that they could learn parts of from the men who practiced it, but that they could not replicate fully without the years of accumulated, deeply embedded learning that the Piegan brought to it. The head-smashed-in buffalo jump in what is now southern Alberta, a UNESCO World Heritage Site today, preserves the physical evidence of what this system looked like at scale. The drive lines, the long converging lines of stone cairns and brush piles that guided the herds toward the jump and the impound, were maintained structures. They were infrastructure. The knowledge required to use them correctly, to read the conditions on a given day and determine whether they were right for a drive, to position the runners correctly relative to the herd and the wind, to lead the animals through the drive lines without triggering panic at the wrong moment, was transmitted knowledge, learned knowledge, the kind that a people accumulates over generations of practice in a specific landscape and transmits by teaching. There is a broader point here that the physical evidence at Head Smashed In makes concrete. The drive lines at that site are not the work of a single season. Archaeological study of the site, which has been in continuous use for close to 6,000 years, shows that the same lines of stone cairns were maintained and rebuilt across generations. The knowledge of how to use them was transmitted across those same generations, and the two things, the physical infrastructure and the transmitted knowledge of how to work it, were inseparable. A set of drive lines without the knowledge of how to read the conditions for a drive, how to position the runners and manage the herd from the moment of first contact through the full length of the chute, was a set of rocks on a hillside. The knowledge without the infrastructure was incomplete in a different way. Both had to be maintained simultaneously, across time, by people who understood what they were maintaining and why. This is the fact that most of the accounts written by European observers in the 18th and early 19th centuries could not quite frame accurately, because it did not fit the categories they were working with. They could see the physical structures. They could observe the hunting methods in operation. What they could not easily see was that what they were observing was not a collection of techniques, but an integrated system, built up over a very long time, that required all of its parts to be working together simultaneously in order to function. Remove the knowledge of the snow and the wind and the daily movement of the herds, and the Pis'kun was useless. Remove the Pis'kun and the drive lines, and the winter harvest could not be conducted at the scale that kept the band fed through the cold months. Remove the memory of past winters held by the elders, and the hunters could not contextualize what they were seeing in the present season against the record of what those conditions had meant before. It was a system. The French and English trappers who entered it from the outside were seeing its surface. The voyagers and trappers who came into this country looking for beaver pelts were men who understood the winter in their own ways. They knew cold. They knew snow. They knew the difficulty of moving through difficult country when the temperature dropped far below freezing and the wind came hard off the mountains. What they saw in the Piegan winter camps was that cold, and snow, and difficult country were not only obstacles to be survived but a text to be read, a record of everything that had happened on the landscape in the last hours and days, and that the people who read it most fluently were the ones who had been reading it longest. The Piegan elder Saukamappee, sitting with the young David Thompson through the long evenings of the winter of 1787 and 1788, told him stories of Piegan life that stretched back before anyone then living could remember. He told him about the wars with the Shoshone and the arrival of the first horses, about the smallpox that had come through the camps and remade the world, about the way things had been before any of those events changed them. What he was also doing, without framing it this way, was telling Thompson what it meant to live in a country long enough to know it as the Piegan knew it, not to pass through it, not to move across it for a season or a year, but to live in it across generations, to accumulate the kind of relationship with a specific place that changes how you see it, that makes the winter snow not a blank surface but a document, the bare hillside not an obstacle but a landmark with a history, the movement of the herds not a mystery, but a pattern that the informed eye can read from the signs left behind. When Thompson left the Piegan camp in the spring of 1788, he had learned to read some of that document. He had learned enough Piegan to communicate, enough about the winter landscape to navigate it with greater skill than he had brought into it. He spent the next several decades mapping a continent, and the skills he acquired among the Piegan, the attention to landscape, the habit of reading the natural world for the information it contained, the understanding that the land was always saying something to whoever was paying sufficient attention, ran through all of it. The French trappers who followed the trade routes north and west in the 1750s and 1760s came into the Blackfoot country looking for beaver, which were the currency of the North American fur trade in those years. They found a people who were not interested in trapping beaver, who considered the buffalo central to everything that mattered and the beaver a secondary concern, and who were the acknowledged masters of the country they occupied. The relationship between the fur trade and the Blackfoot Confederacy was complicated and frequently violent, particularly after American trappers began working the upper Missouri in the early 1800s. But through all of it, what the traders and the trappers who recorded their experiences honestly acknowledged was that the Piegan and their Confederates understood the northern plains in winter with a thoroughness that no one who arrived from outside could match. There is also something worth saying about the way this knowledge was organized socially, because it was not the private property of individual hunters. It was held by the band as a whole, distributed across different people who carried different parts of it, and transmitted through practices that were embedded in the daily life of the winter camp rather than set apart as formal instruction. The women of the camp knew things the hunters needed to know. They knew the condition of the hides coming in, which told them about the health of the herd and the stage of the winter. They knew the signs of a Chinook coming, which would change the snow condition and therefore change the hunting strategy. The elders carried the memory of past winters, which the hunters drew on when current conditions resembled something the old men and women had seen before. A young man learning to hunt was not learning from a single teacher, but from the entire community of people whose combined knowledge, held together, constituted the full picture of the winter landscape. This is one of the things that the outside observers, however careful, consistently missed in their accounts. They watched individual hunters and described individual skills. What they were actually watching was the visible edge of a collective system of knowledge that ran through the whole band, and that no single person held completely. When a hunter walked out before dawn and came back with accurate information about where the herds had moved, he was drawing on what he himself had learned over years, but he was also drawing on what his father had told him about this particular valley in this particular kind of winter, and on what the old woman at the edge of the camp had said last evening about the way the wind had shifted, and on the accumulated weight of everything the band collectively knew about the relationship between weather and animal movement in this stretch of country. The reading of the snow was the final act. The preparation for it ran back through his entire life. The specific knowledge of tracking in snow, reading the age and condition and meaning of animal signs in the winter landscape, was one part of a much larger system. But it was the part that most surprised the outside observers, because it was the part that was most directly demonstrable. A man who could look at a set of tracks in the snow and tell you not only what animal left them, but roughly how many hours ago, whether the animal was moving at a walk or a trot, whether it was alone or in a group, and approximately where it would be now given the time and the conditions, was doing something that looked, to an observer who lacked the underlying knowledge, very much like something other than what it was. It was not magic. It was not intuition in any mystical sense. It was pattern recognition built from years of careful observation, applied to a specific problem in a specific landscape by someone who had spent a lifetime learning to see what the snow had to say. The Piegan who demonstrated this to David Thompson in the winter of 1787, who walked out before dawn and came back with information about the herds that would guide the next day's hunting, were doing what their parents had taught them and what they would teach their children. They were reading. And what they were reading had been written not by human hands, but by the cold and the wind and the hooves of the buffalo moving through the timbered valleys where the winter grass was still accessible beneath the snow. George Bird Grinnell, writing at the end of the 19th century, recorded what the old men and women of the Blackfoot bands remembered of this life. He recorded the hunting methods, the winter camps, the seasonal movements, the careful engineering of the Pis'kun and the drive lines, the detailed knowledge of animal behavior that made those systems work. He did it because the life he was recording was already ending, because the buffalo were gone and the old ways of reading the winter landscape had lost their practical application, but also because the men and women who had lived that life understood, as he came to understand, that what they had known deserved to be written down. They were right about that, because what they had known was not a simple thing. It was not a collection of tricks or techniques that could be summarized in a paragraph. It was a relationship with a specific piece of the world built across generations that allowed the people who held it to survive in conditions that would have defeated anyone who did not, and to feed their families through the northern winter by reading the snow for everything it had to tell them. David Thompson left the Piegan camp in the spring of 1788 with a broken leg that was still healing and a notebook that was filling up with observations he would spend the next 40 years refining and extending. He went on to become the greatest land geographer the continent has produced, mapping rivers and mountains and passes across an area of more than 3.5 million square miles. He mapped more of North America than any other person. But the winter he spent among the Piegan was the foundational season, the one in which he first understood that the land contained more information than any instrument he carried could measure, and that the people who read it most completely were the ones who had been reading it the longest. The skills he learned in that camp were part of what made him able to do it. The Piegan elder Saukamappee, who told him the old stories through the long evenings of that winter, died in that country and is not separately remembered by name in any historical record outside of Thompson's journals. The knowledge he carried lived on in the people who learned it from him and from those who came before him, passed from parent to child in the winter camps along the timbered river valleys east of the mountains, for as long as those camps existed and that life was possible. Remember that. Remember what was known and how it was held and what it cost to hold it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.